What if you received an invitation you couldn't refuse? Not because you wanted to go, but because it wouldn't let you stay away. That's what James felt when his phone buzzed at exactly 11:45 p.m., the screen lighting up his dark London flat with an eerie glow. The last performance, exclusive attendance only, arrived by midnight. No sender, no number, just a location pin glowing ominously in Covent Garden. He stared at it, his thumb hovering over the delete button, but something stopped him. The message felt alive, pulsing with an urgency that sank into his bones. James wasn't the superstitious type. A 28-year-old graphic designer, he spent his days hunched over a laptop, tweaking layouts for clients who never appreciated the effort. He liked control, clean lines, predictable outcomes. This message, though, was chaos. He tried replying, but the screen froze, pixels warping into a jagged mess before snapping back to normal. His smartwatch beeped, syncing the message automatically as if to ensure he couldn't ignore it. A cold sweat prickled his neck. 10 minutes later, his flat buzzed with chaos of a different kind. Sophie burst in, her blonde hair tangled from the wind, clutching her phone like it was a live grenade. "James, tell me you got this too," she demanded, shoving the identical message in his face. Daniel followed, grinning like a kid on Halloween, his tablet already open to a map app that showed nothing. No record of the Orpheum Theater existed online. Not on Google, not on X, not even in the dusty corners of Reddit. Oliver trailed, behind quieter, his eyes darting to the corners of the room as if expecting something to leap out. "It's got to be a prank," James said, but his voice wavered. Sophie's past. A childhood spent in a creaky old house with a mother who swore. It was haunted, made her jumpy, and this was hitting too close to home. Daniel, ever the thrill-seeker, bounced on his heels. "Exclusive? Midnight? Come on, we're going." Oliver shook his head, his voice low. "I've got a bad feeling about this." James felt it too, a gnawing dread, but curiosity was a sharper blade, slicing through his hesitation. By 11:57 p.m., they were crammed into an Uber, the city's neon lights smearing past the rain-streaked windows. The driver, a gruff man with a thick accent, muttered about the alley being a dead end but dropped them off anyway. The mist hung heavy, curling around the streetlights like phantom fingers. Then they saw it. The Orpheum Theater, a Victorian monstrosity of iron and stone, its neon sign flickering the last performance in stuttering red letters. It shouldn't have been there. Not in a city James knew like the back of his hand. The building loomed, its presence oppressive, swallowing the sounds of the night. No ticket booth, no crowd, just heavy red doors cracked open, spilling darkness into the alley. James checked his phone. No signal. Sophie whispered, "This feels wrong," her breath visible in the damp air. Daniel laughed, but it sounded forced. Oliver's fingers tightened on his jacket, his knuckles white. Then all four phones buzzed at once, screens glowing in unison. "Take your seats, the show is about to begin." The words burned into James's vision, and the doors creaked wider, revealing nothing but a void. His legs moved before his mind could catch up, pulled by something he couldn't name. They stepped inside, and the world they knew vanished. The air inside the Orpheum Theater hit James like a slap, cold, stale, tinged with rust and decay. The lobby stretched impossibly wide, its dark wooden walls climbing toward a ceiling lost in shadow. Antique sconces flickered, their light too, weak to push back the gloom. The door slammed shut behind them with a thud that echoed like a gunshot, and James spun around, heart lurching. The exit was gone, just a blank wall where the door had been. Daniel let out a low whistle, his bravado faltering. "This place is unreal. Look at the detail." He ran a hand over the velvet wallpaper, but his fingers came away coated in dust. Sophie hugged herself, her eyes flicking to the grand staircase spiraling up to the balcony. "There's no one here," she murmured. "No staff, no nothing." Oliver stayed silent, his breathing shallow, his gaze fixed on the shadows. James pulled out his phone again. desperate for a lifeline. The screen glitched, lines of static slicing through the message still frozen there. The last performance, exclusive attendance only. He tapped it, but the device vibrated violently, then died. Sophie's followed, then Daniel's, then Oliver's, all 4 screens blacking out in unison. A faint hum buzzed through the air, like static from an old radio. From beyond the auditorium doors, a murmur rose, a crowd's chatter soft and distant. James frowned. "Do you hear that?" Daniel nodded, already moving toward the sound, his curiosity overriding caution. The others followed, their footsteps muffled by a threadbare carpet that reeked of mildew. They pushed through the heavy curtains into the theater proper and stopped dead. Rows of empty seats stretched before them, crimson velvet faded and torn. The stage loomed ahead, framed by tattered gold curtains, its boards warped and stained. But the murmur persisted, louder now, a chorus of voices with no source. James scanned the seats. Nothing. Yet the sound pressed against his ears, insistent, alive. Their phones buzzed back to life, screens flaring with a new message. "Take your seats. The show is about to begin." Oliver flinched. "This isn't right. We should go." But Daniel was already sliding into a front row seat, grinning. "Come on, live a little." James hesitated, his gut screaming to run, but Sophie sat too, her hands trembling. Reluctantly, he joined them, Oliver last, his face pale. The seats clicked beneath them, mechanical locks snapping into place. James jolted, yanking at the armrests, but they wouldn't budge. The lights dimmed, plunging the theater into near darkness, and the curtains parted with a groan. A Victorian study materialized on stage. Bookshelves, a crackling fireplace, a high-backed chair facing away. It was too real, too perfect. A figure stepped out, a man in a tailcoat, his movements jerky, like a marionette with snapped strings. His face was sharp, skin stretched taut over high cheekbones, eyes sunken and unblinking. He turned to the audience, to them, and his mouth opened, but the sound lagged, a distorted echo of layered voices. "Welcome to the final act." Whispers erupted, not from the stage but from their phones. James's screen lit up, words scrolling too fast to read, then settling. "You have been assigned a role. Stand when your name is called." His pulse spiked. Sophie's phone showed the same. Daniel laughed nervously. "What is this, improv night?" The actor's head snapped toward them, neck twisting at an impossible angle. "James Edward Harrow," he intoned, voice booming through the empty theater. The unseen audience roared with applause, thunderous, deafening. James froze, his name echoing like a death knell. His legs twitched, urging him to stand, but he fought it. "James, we need to go," Sophie hissed, grabbing his arm. But before he could move, the actor spoke again. "Sophie Marie Ellison." She gasped, rising without meaning to, her body rigid. Her phone buzzed, a script appearing. Lines she hadn't written, words she didn't know. She spoke them anyway, her voice not her own. "The stage claims its own." James lunged for her, but she flickered, her form glitching like a corrupted video file lagging between frames. He recoiled, hands shaking. The mirrors lining the walls caught his eye. Massive, gilded, reflecting not the empty theater, but a packed house. Faces twisted and silent screams stared back, clapping endlessly. Oliver's name came next. He stood instantly, eyes wide, pleading. "James, don't let go." James grabbed him, but Oliver's skin burned under his grip, crumbling like ash. In the mirror, a perfect Oliver already stood on stage, blank-faced, waiting. The real Oliver vanished, his seat empty. Daniel bolted up, panic breaking his bravado. "What the hell is happening?" The actor turned to him, jaw dropping too low, unhinged. "Daniel Joseph Reed." Daniel screamed, clawing at the seat, but his body betrayed him, marching him forward. James's phone vibrated. "Your cue is next." The whispers grew louder, seeping from the walls, the seats, his own skull. He looked at the mirrors again. His reflection was already there, smiling. The stage lights flared, blinding him. His legs moved, dragging him forward against his will. The audience of ghosts cheered louder, their applause a cage closing around him. He was part of the play now, and he didn't know his lines. James's breath shredded his lungs as his phone flashed. "Your cue is next." The words seared into the screen, glowing brighter than the spotlight pinning him in place. His body trembled, sweat soaking his shirt, but he couldn't stop his legs from carrying him toward the stage. The whispers from the mirrors swelled, a chorus of voices chanting his name, his full name, over and over. The actor, or whatever it was, stood motionless at center stage, its hollow eyes locked on him. Behind it, Oliver's replacement waited, posture perfect, face devoid of fear or life. Sophie's double joined them, her movements fluid yet wrong, like a doll animated by unseen hands. James's stomach churned. They weren't his friends anymore, they were props. The spotlight burned hotter, his shadow twisting on the floor into something jagged, inhuman. He clawed at his pockets, fumbling for his phone, desperate to break the connection. The screen flickered violently, then displayed a script. His script. Lines he'd never seen, words he didn't recognize. "I surrender to the role. I am the performance." His mouth opened, but he clamped it shut, teeth grinding. Daniel's voice cut through the haze. "James, fight it!" He was still in his seat, thrashing against the invisible restraints, his tablet clattering to the floor. The actor's head jerked toward Daniel, jaw unhinging further, and hissed his name again. Daniel's scream died as his body went limp, then stood, marching to join the others on stage. James's phone buzzed again, a countdown. 10, 9, 8. His vision blurred, pain lancing through his chest. He looked down. His hand was fading, pixels dissolving into the air. He was glitching, just like Sophie had. The countdown hit 5. Panic seized him, and he hurled the phone to the ground, stomping it underfoot. The screen shattered, but instead of glass, a black void erupted, tendrils snaking out, screeching like a wounded animal. The theater shook. The mirrors exploded, glass raining down in slow motion, reflecting 1,000 fractured versions of James, each one smiling, each one waiting. The ghostly audience screamed, their forms flickering like dying signals on a TV screen. The seats tore apart, velvet splitting, wood splintering, as the chandelier above swung wildly, crystals crashing to the floor. James's legs gave out, released. From the pull, he hit the ground hard, gasping, dust choking his lungs. The stage was empty now, except for a figure in tattered Victorian rags, faceless, towering over the chaos. It raised a skeletal hand, pointing at him, its form unstable, shifting between solid and static. "Run!" Sophie's voice, not her double's, pierced the noise. She and Daniel, the real ones, were beside him, yanking him up. The theater folded in on itself, walls collapsing, ceiling buckling, like a program crashing. They sprinted for the doors, adrenaline burning through James's veins. The red doors loomed ahead, still cracked open. They burst through, tumbling into the alley, the cold night air slamming into them. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. James spun around, the theater was gone. No rubble, no trace, just wet pavement and distant car horns. He turned to Sophie and Daniel, their faces pale, chests heaving. Did we just, he stammered. Before anyone could answer, his smartwatch buzzed, the cracked screen flickering to life. A message from Oliver's number. Rehearsals begin soon. Sophie grabbed his wrist, her nails digging in. Her lips moved, whispering a line from the script she shouldn't know. The stage claims its own. Her eyes widened in horror as she realized what she'd said. The alley stretched darker, the mist closing in, and James knew they hadn't escaped at all. James stood frozen, Sophie's whispered line echoing in his skull. Her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a sob, while Daniel backed away, staring at her like she was a stranger. The alley felt tighter, the shadows deeper, as if the theater had followed them out, its presence lingering in the damp air. James's smartwatch buzzed again, the cracked screen glowing faintly. The last performance never ends. He ripped the watch off, hurling it into the mist, but the buzzing didn't stop. It echoed in his ears, a sound he couldn't shake. Sophie's breathing hitched, her eyes darting to the empty street. "I didn't mean to say it," she whispered, voice cracking. "It just came out." Daniel's hands shook as he pulled out his tablet, the screen glitching despite being offline, showing a live feed of the stage. Empty, waiting. James grabbed them both, pulling them toward the main road. "We need to get out of here. Now." They stumbled forward, the city waking up around them, headlights cutting through the fog, a distant siren wailing. But every step felt heavier, like invisible strings tugged them back. Sophie stopped, clutching her head. "It's still in me," she rasped. "I can feel it." They reached a busy street, neon signs flickering above a late-night diner. James pushed them inside, the warmth and chatter a stark contrast to the nightmare they'd fled. He checked his reflection in the glass door. His face was his own, but his eyes looked wrong. Too still, too hollow. He blinked, and it was gone. Sophie slumped into a booth, staring at her hands. "What if we never left?" she murmured. Daniel sat beside her, silent for once, his bravado shattered. Oh. James's phone, forgotten in his pocket, vibrated once more. He pulled it out, dread pooling in his gut. The screen showed a photo. The three of them on stage, smiling, perfect, dated an hour ago. The diner's lights flickered, and James looked up. Across the street where the alley had been stood the Orpheum Theater, its neon sign blazing in the night. He thought it was over, but the stage was still watching. Have you ever woken up somewhere you didn't belong, with no memory of how you got there? Like the world slipped out from under you while you weren't looking? That's what James felt as his eyes fluttered open, staring at a ceiling he didn't recognize. The room was pristine, a hotel suite with crisp white sheets, sleek furniture, and a faint hum from an air vent. But the familiarity was a lie. His mind scrambled for a thread of recollection and found nothing. James sat up, his body aching like he'd run a marathon in his sleep. He was still in his jeans and sweater from the night before, or what he thought was the night before. The bedside clock blinked 3:12 a.m. in cold red digits. His phone rested on the nightstand, perfectly aligned, its screen dark. No notifications, no missed calls, just a blank slate mocking his confusion. He rubbed his temples, trying to piece it together. A bar in Shoreditch. Laughter. Clinking glasses. Then, blank. The air smelled sterile, laced with a chemical edge. That stung his nostrils. A smart speaker sat in the corner, its blue ring pulsing faintly as if listening. "Hello?" James croaked, half expecting an AI voice to respond. Silence answered instead, thick and heavy, broken only by a creak from the walls, like the building itself was shifting. His skin prickled. He wasn't supposed to be here. He swung his legs over the bed, bare feet brushing the cool hardwood floor. His wallet and keys were gone, but a hotel key card sat beside his phone unmarked, its glossy surface reflecting the dim light. James frowned. Had he checked in? The thought felt foreign, like someone else's memory planted in his skull. He reached for his phone, thumbs brushing the screen to life, but it flickered oddly, a glitch rippling across the display before settling. Movement caught his eye, a shadow shifting in the corner. His head snapped toward the closet, its sliding, door ajar by a sliver, revealing a void of darkness within. His pulse spiked. He hadn't touched it. He hadn't even seen it until now. The gap was too perfect, too deliberate, like an invitation or a trap. A soft rustle came from inside, faint but undeniable, like fabric brushing against itself. James froze, breath caught in his throat. His phone buzzed once, sharp and jarring, and he nearly dropped it. The screen lit up with a message. No sender, no number. Do not open. His stomach twisted, eyes darting back to the closet. The gap, seemed wider now, though he couldn't be sure. Then a sound, low, deliberate, exhaled. Not his breath. Something else's. It drifted from the closet, curling into the room like smoke, and James's blood ran cold. He wasn't alone in this sterile cage of a suite, and whatever was with him had been waiting. The smart speaker's blue ring flared, brighter, and a distorted whisper crackled through it. "Stay still." James's heart hammered as he realized this wasn't a hotel. This was something else entirely. James's breath hitched, the exhaled sound from the closet echoing in his skull. The darkness beyond the door felt alive, a gaping maw swallowing the faint light from the room. His hands trembled as he clutched his phone, the "Do Not Open" message, glowing like a warning carved in stone. He wanted to believe it was a prank, a hacked device, a sick joke, but the air pressed against him, heavy with something wrong. He took a shaky step back, eyes locked on the closet. The rustling came again, slower this time, deliberate, like something was adjusting itself, settling in. His mind raced. He was a 30-year-old accountant, not a hero from some horror film. He liked numbers, routine, the quiet of his flat. This wasn't his world, yet here he was, trapped in a nightmare with no exit. The hotel phone rang, a shrill, old-fashioned trill that sliced through the silence. James flinched, his gaze darting to the nightstand where the sleek black receiver vibrated with each ring. Who could it be? No one knew he was here, not even him. His fingers hesitated, then lifted it to his ear, the plastic cold against his skin. Static crackled, then silence, followed by a voice. His voice. "Do not turn around," it said, low and calm. James's stomach lurched. He fought the urge to spin, every muscle screaming against the instinct. The mirror across the room loomed in his peripheral vision, its surface gleaming under the dim recessed lights. He didn't want to look, but his head turned anyway, a traitor to his own will. There, at the foot of the bed, stood him, smiling. The reflection wasn't just a trick, it was too real, too solid. Same dark hair, same sweater, but the smile was wrong, too wide, too sharp, like it knew something James didn't. His knees buckled, but he caught himself on the bed frame, breath shallow. The smart speaker pulsed again, its voice garbled. "You're not alone anymore." His phone buzzed, screen flaring with another message. "It's watching." James's throat tightened. He stumbled toward the door, any door, but the suite's layout twisted his senses. The exit should have been to his left, but it wasn't there, just a blank wall where a handle should have been. The room was changing, or he was losing his grip. The closet creaked, the door sliding open another inch. James whipped around, heart pounding. Pale fingers curled around the edge, long, lifeless, resting there like they'd always belonged. His breath caught. Whoever, whatever was inside wasn't rushing out. It was waiting, patient, savoring his fear. He grabbed the keycard and bolted for the bathroom, the only other door he could see. The tiles were cold underfoot, the fluorescent light flickering as he slammed the door shut and locked it. His phone buzzed again. "You can't hide." The words pulsed, then vanished, replaced by a live feed, a shaky camera view of the suite, centered on the closet. The door was fully open now, but nothing stood there. James's chest heaved. He swiped at the screen, but the app wouldn't close. It wasn't even an app he recognized. The feed shifted, panning to the bathroom door, his door, from the outside. Something was out there holding the camera. His hands shook as he backed against the sink, the porcelain biting into his spine. A knock came, soft, rhythmic, from the bathroom door. 3 slow taps. James's blood froze. He didn't answer, didn't breathe. The smart speaker in the main room crackled to life. "Let me in, James." His voice again, but layered, distorted, like a dozen recordings played at once. The knocking stopped. Silence stretched, unbearable. Then, the lights flickered, and the bathroom mirror reflected not his face, but the suite behind him. The closet was empty, except for him. James, lying on the floor, still as death. His real body trembled, but the reflection didn't move. His phone buzzed. Time to switch. The words glowed, then the screen went black. The bathroom door rattled, the lock clicking open on its own. James grabbed a towel rack, ripping it from the wall as a makeshift weapon, but his hands felt numb, distant. Footsteps approached, soft, deliberate, echoing in the tiled space. The mirror flickered again, and now the other James stood behind him, inches away, its smile unwavering. James swung the rack, but it passed through nothing. Air where a body should have been. The smart speaker laughed, a hollow mechanical sound. "You're not the first," it said as the lights dimmed. James's vision blurred, his body growing heavy like something was draining him from the inside. The closet door in the mirror swung wide, revealing darkness, and a figure stepping out. It wore his face, but its eyes were empty, black voids. It moved toward him, unhurried, inevitable. James screamed, but the sound died in his throat. His phone slipped from his grip, clattering to the floor, its screen flashing one last message. "Welcome home." The bathroom door creaked open fully, and the figure reached for him. He couldn't fight it. His limbs locked, his mind fraying. The other James was too close now, too real. And as it touched him, James felt himself fading, slipping into the void he'd woken up in. James's scream choked off as the figure's cold fingers brushed his arm. His body wasn't his anymore. Limbs heavy, unresponsive, like a puppet with cut strings. The bathroom mirror flickered wildly, reflecting the other James standing behind him, its smile stretching wider, unnatural. The air thickened, suffocating, as the smart speaker's laughter warped into a low, unending drone. His phone lay on the tiles, screen cracked but glowing. "Welcome home." The words pulsed, then shifted to a live feed. James saw himself standing rigid, while the figure circled him like a predator sizing up prey. He tried to move, to swing the towel rack again, but his arms wouldn't obey. Pain bloomed in his chest, sharp and tearing, as if something inside was clawing its way out. The figure spoke, not aloud but through the speaker. "You've been hollow too long." James's vision swam, memories flashing. Nights alone in his flat, the hum of his laptop, a life of quiet routine. Had he always felt this empty? The thought gnawed at him, but it wasn't his. It was planted, forced into his skull by whatever this thing was. The lights surged, then died, plunging the bathroom into darkness. Only the phone's glow remained, casting jagged shadows. The figure stepped closer, its face, his face, inches from his own. Its breath was cold, reeking of damp earth, and its eyes were bottomless pits, swallowing light. James's knees buckled, but he didn't fall. Something held him up, invisible, relentless. His phone buzzed violently, the feed glitching to show the closet again. There, crumpled on the floor, was him. Not a reflection, not a trick. His body lifeless, eyes open and blank. The realization hit like a sledgehammer. He wasn't the original. He was the replacement. Or was he? His mind fractured, unable to hold the truth. The figure's hand clamped onto his shoulder, fingers sinking in like ice. James gasped, his skin glitching, fading in and out, pixels dissolving into the air. The speaker crackled. "It's already inside you." His chest burned, his heartbeat erratic, as if two rhythms fought for control. He clawed at his shirt, but his hands passed through nothing. His body was unraveling. The bathroom door slammed shut, trapping him with the thing wearing his face. It tilted its head, studying him, then leaned in, whispering directly into his ear. "You invited me." The words burrowed into his brain and a memory surfaced. Unlocking his phone last night, downloading an app he didn't recognize, clicking accept without reading. Had that been the start? The mirror flared back to life, showing the suite, empty, now except for the closet. The figure dragged James toward it, his feet sliding uselessly across the tiles. He fought, thrashing against the pull, but his strength was gone. The closet loomed, its darkness a void that pulsed with hunger. His phone buzzed one last time. "You are not the first." He was shoved inside, the door slamming shut behind him. The space was impossibly vast, endless black stretching in every direction. Faces flickered in the gloom, others like him, hollowed out, staring with empty eyes. The figure stood before him, shedding its disguise. Its skin peeled away, revealing a skeletal frame wrapped in shadow. James's body locked up, his voice stolen. The thing reached into his chest, not physically, but deeper, tugging at something vital, something he couldn't name. His vision splintered, colors bleeding into static, as the speaker's voice echoed from nowhere. "Time to rest." The closet swallowed him, the darkness folding in. He felt himself slipping, dissolving into the void. The last thing he saw was the figure stepping out, wearing his face perfectly, heading back into the suite. And then, nothing. Just the hum of the smart speaker, waiting for its next guest. James didn't know when he stopped existing, or if he ever truly had. The darkness of the closet held him, a weightless limbo where time didn't reach. His last memory, of the figure walking away, wearing his skin, faded into a dull ache. Then sensation returned, the crisp sheets, the sterile air, the hum of the vent. His eyes snapped open. He was back in the hotel bed, the room unchanged. The clock blinked 3:12 a.m. again. His phone sat on the nightstand, screen dark, keycard beside it. James sat up, heart pounding, but his body felt off, too light, too smooth, like he'd been remade. He stumbled to the bathroom, flicking on the light, and stared into the mirror. His face looked back, normal, tired, human, but his eyes were wrong, too still, too deep. The smart speaker pulsed blue, its voice soft. "Good morning, James." He flinched, backing away, but the closet door caught his eye, closed now, unassuming. His phone buzzed, a single message. Time to switch. The words sank into him, and he knew. He wasn't the one who'd woken up. He was the hollow guest, now left behind. He stumbled to the suite's door, yanking it open. The hallway stretched endlessly, doors identical on either side, no exit in sight. His reflection in a wall mirror smiled at him, wider than he ever could. The real James, or whatever had taken him, was gone, living his life while he was trapped here, a shell in a prison disguised as luxury. Days blurred into nights, or maybe there were no days at all. The room reset each time he blinked. Bed made, phone dark, clock frozen at 3:12 a.m. He screamed once, but the sound died against, the walls swallowed by the silence. The smart speaker whispered lines he didn't remember speaking. "You're home now? Rest well? You invited me." James sat on the bed, staring at the closet. It was shut, but he felt it watching, waiting for the next guest to stumble into its trap. He'd survived in a way, but he was never the same. And neither was the thing that wore his face, out there in the world he'd lost. Have you ever stepped into a place that shouldn't exist? A corner of the world that feels like it's been waiting for you to notice it? James had that thought as he stood on the platform of Blackwell Station, a train ticket trembling in his hand. The paper was brittle, yellowed, the ink smudged into near illegibility. Blackwell Station one way. He didn't remember buying it, didn't recall descending into this forgotten depth of the London Underground. Yet here he was, the air thick with damp stone and rust. James was a 32-year-old history teacher, a man who prided himself on knowing London's sprawling web of tunnels and tracks. He could recite the tube's history, its wartime shelters, its abandoned stations. But Blackwell wasn't on any map he'd ever studied. The platform stretched before him, tiles cracked and moss-stained, lit by flickering bulbs that buzzed like dying insects. No signs hung on the walls, no digital boards announced arrivals. Just silence, heavy and absolute. His phone was useless down here. No signal. The screen dimmed despite a full battery. He tapped it anyway, hoping for a glitch to explain this, but the time froze at 11:47 p.m. Last he remembered, he'd been at a pub quiz with colleagues laughing over a pint. Now his coat was damp, his boots scuffed, as if he'd walked miles to reach this place. The disconnect gnawed at him, a splinter in his mind he couldn't pull free. Then he noticed them, the others. 5 figures stood along the platform, spaced too evenly, their backs to him, faces turned toward the empty tracks. They didn't move, didn't speak, their silhouettes stark against the dim light. James's throat tightened. He wasn't a paranoid man, but their stillness felt rehearsed, unnatural, like statues waiting to be activated. A low rumble shook. The ground, distant but growing. The air shifted, a cold wind tunneling through the station, carrying the scent of oil and decay. James's pulse quickened as the sound swelled, a train approaching from the void beyond the platform's edge. His smartwatch buzzed once, a faint vibration against his wrist, but the screen was blank. No notifications, no explanation. The headlights pierced the darkness first, 2 pale eyes cutting through the gloom. The train rolled in, ancient and tarnished, its carriages creaking as if they hadn't moved in decades. James stepped back, instinct screaming this wasn't right. The others didn't flinch, their stillness unbroken even as the wind whipped their coats. The doors slid open with a whisper, revealing a flickering interior. Empty seats, peeling, paint, a faint hum of electricity. James's phone buzzed in his pocket, screen flaring to life despite the dead signal. Bored now, his stomach dropped. He didn't want to, didn't trust it, but the message felt like a command etched into his bones. The others began to move, slow, deliberate steps toward the train, their silence deafening. James clutched the ticket tighter, its edges crumbling under his fingers. He knew, somehow, that this train wasn't taking him home. It was taking him somewhere else entirely, and he wasn't sure he'd come back. The train screeched to a halt, its brakes grinding like a wounded animal. James stood rooted to the platform, the cold seeping through his boots as the others glided aboard, 5 shadows slipping into the carriage without a sound. The doors hung open, an unspoken invitation, while the flickering lights inside cast long, warped shadows across the seats. His smartwatch buzzed again, insistent, but still showed nothing. Just a blank face mocking his isolation. He took a shaky breath, glancing back at the stairs he'd come down. They were gone. Where an exit should have been stood a wall of chipped brick, damp and ancient, as if it had always been there. His chest tightened, panic clawing up his throat. He was trapped, above, below, nowhere to run but forward. The train's hum grew, louder, impatient. James's phone vibrated, screen glowing. "This is your train." The words pulsed, then vanished, replaced by a grainy photo. Him standing on this platform taken from above. His head snapped up, searching for a camera, but the ceiling was bare, just cracked plaster and flickering bulbs. Someone, or something, had been watching. One of the passengers turned, a woman in a gray coat, her face half hidden by a scarf. She didn't speak, didn't gesture, just tilted her head toward the open door. Her eyes were dark, too dark, like ink spilled across her sockets. James's skin crawled. "I don't belong here," he muttered, but his voice sounded thin, swallowed by the station's oppressive silence. The doors began to close, metal scraping metal. James's body moved before his mind could stop it. He lunged forward, slipping inside just as they sealed shut. The train lurched, throwing him against a pole, and the platform vanished into darkness beyond the fogged windows. His breath fogged the air, the temperature plunging as the carriage rattled forward. Inside, the silence was worse. The 5 passengers sat evenly spaced, staring ahead, hands folded in their laps. James gripped the pole, his knuckles white, avoiding their gaze. The seats were worn, fabric splitting to reveal yellowed stuffing, and the walls bore scratches. Faint, frantic marks like someone had clawed at them. His phone buzzed again. "Sit." He didn't want to obey, but his legs ached, and the weight of their stares pressed him down. He slid into a seat across from the woman in gray, her scarf slipping slightly to reveal a jaw too sharp, skin too tight. She didn't blink. None of them did. James's heart hammered, his mind racing for an explanation, hallucination, dream, anything. But the ticket in his pocket felt too real, its edges cutting into his palm. The lights flickered, plunging the carriage into brief darkness. When they returned, the passengers were closer, still seated, but nearer, as if the train had shrunk around him. James's breath hitched. He checked his phone. No signal, no apps, just a new message. "You're expected." His smartwatch synced it, buzzing against his wrist like a second pulse. A man in a dark suit stood suddenly, though James hadn't seen him move. He was beside him now, too close, his face blank, eyes hollow, mouth a thin line. He pointed to the seat James occupied, then to the window. James stammered, I didn't mean to." But the man's head tilted, slow and mechanical, silencing him. The windows showed nothing, just black, an endless void swallowing the train's path. James's reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed, but it flickered, lagging like a video out of sync. His phone buzzed. "This seat was never yours." The words sank in, cold and final, as the man sat back down, still facing him. The train shuddered, a deep groan echoing through the metal. The lights dimmed again, and when they flared back, the passengers were all looking at him. 5 pairs of empty eyes, unblinking, unwavering. James's throat closed, his hands trembling as he clutched his phone. It buzzed once more, screen glitching. "They know you now." A child appeared at the far end of the carriage, not there a moment ago. She was small, maybe 8, in a faded dress, her hair lank and wet. She didn't sit, didn't move, just stared, her eyes matching the others. James's stomach twisted. He hadn't seen her board, hadn't heard her approach. The train's hum deepened, vibrating through his bones. The woman in gray leaned forward, her scarf falling completely. Her face was wrong, too smooth, too symmetrical, like a mask stretched over nothing. She whispered, soundless, her lips forming words he couldn't hear but felt. "Stay with us." James recoiled, slamming against the seat, but the pole was gone. He was boxed in. His smartwatch beeped. A countdown, 10, 9, 8. He yanked at it, but it wouldn't budge, the strap tightening like a shackle. The child took a step closer, her bare feet silent on the filthy floor. The lights flickered again, and the scratches on the walls glowed faintly. Names, dates, please carved into the metal. The train sped up, the void outside pressing against the windows. James's phone flashed a live feed. Him, sitting there, surrounded by the passengers, their faces blurring into static. He wasn't alone anymore. He was one of them, or soon would be. The countdown hit 5. The child smiled, her teeth too many, too sharp. The man in the suit gripped his wrist, fingers cold and unyielding, pulling him forward. James fought, thrashing, but his strength ebbed, draining into the train's relentless rhythm. The lights went out, and when they returned, the passengers were standing, circling him, their silence a scream he couldn't escape. Darkness swallowed the carriage, the lights snuffed out like a breath extinguished. James's gasp echoed, the only sound against the crushing silence of the passengers surrounding him. When the bulbs flared back, they were closer, towering over him, their hollow eyes boring into his skull. The man in the suit still held his wrist, fingers icy, tightening as the smartwatch countdown ticked to 4. James yanked his arm, but it was like pulling against stone. His phone slipped from his grip, clattering to the floor, its screen glowing. "This seat was never yours." The words pulsed, then shifted to a live feed. Himself, trapped, the passengers' faces blurring into smears of static. His reflection in the window flickered again, but now it smiled. A slow, knowing grin he didn't feel. The train shuddered violently, metal groaning as if it might tear apart. The child stepped forward, her dress dripping water that pooled impossibly on the dry floor. Her smile widened, teeth glinting under the flickering light, and she whispered, soundless, yet deafening, "You're home." James's chest seized, his breath shallow as the woman in gray leaned in, her mask-like face inches from his. His smartwatch hit 3. Pain lanced through him, sharp and deep, like something was carving him out from the inside. He clawed at his chest, but his hands felt wrong, too light, too distant. The man in the suit released him, only for the child to grab his other arm, her grip small but unbreakable. The passengers pressed closer, their silence a weight crushing his lungs. The lights dimmed and the scratches on the walls flared brighter, names glowing like brands. Alice, 1943. Thomas, 1971. James, 2025. His name, his year, now. His stomach plummeted. This wasn't a train, it was a tomb, collecting souls across decades, and he was the latest addition. His phone buzzed, screen cracking. "You were never real." James screamed, the sound swallowed by the void. The child's hand tightened, her nails digging in, and his skin flickered, pixels dissolving, his arm fading in and out. The woman in gray touched his face, her fingers cold and smooth, peeling away his resistance. His smartwatch hit 2, then 1, and the train lurched, throwing him to the floor. He landed hard, knees bruising against the metal, but the passengers didn't move. They loomed statuesque, their eyes black pits swallowing light. His reflection stepped out of the window. Not a reflection anymore, but a perfect copy wearing his coat, his fear, his life. It knelt beside him, smiling, and whispered in his voice, "It's my turn now." The lights flared, blinding, and the copy stood, taking his seat. James lunged for it, but his hands passed through, nothing solid to grab. The passengers closed in, their hands brushing him, cold and insistent, pulling him back. His phone shattered, glass exploding outward, and the feed showed his copy sitting calmly while he faded into the crowd. The train roared, speeding into the void, and James felt himself unraveling, his body glitching, his mind fracturing. The child giggled, a hollow sound, as the man in the suit lifted him effortlessly, dragging him toward the rear of the carriage. A door appeared where none had been, black, seamless, pulsing with the same hunger as the windows. He was thrown inside, the door slamming shut. Darkness engulfed him, infinite and alive, filled with whispers, hundreds, thousands of voices, all silent yet screaming. Faces flickered in the gloom, Alice, Thomas, others, trapped, hollowed, waiting. His smartwatch beeped one last time. 0. The copy's voice echoed from beyond the door. "Thank you, James." The train shuddered again, and he felt himself dissolve piece by piece, memory by memory, into the endless black. The lights went out for good, and James was gone, or what was left of him was. Nothingness held James, or what had been James, for an eternity that might have been seconds. The darkness was total, a void that erased edges, time, self. Then, sensation crept back. The cold metal floor, the stench of rust and rot, the faint hum of the train. His eyes opened, blinking against a dim, sickly light. He was still inside the carriage, but it was different. Decayed, abandoned. The seats were shredded, stuffing spilling out like entrails, and the walls were corroded, streaked with mold. The passengers sat as before, but now they were husks. Skin stretched over skulls, eyes sunken pits, mouths twitching in silent agony. James's breath caught, his hands trembling as he pushed himself up. His phone was gone, his smartwatch a lifeless band on his wrist. The ticket lay beside him, crumbled to dust, its purpose served. He stumbled to a window, desperate for a glimpse of the world outside, but the glass showed only his reflection. No, not his reflection. The copy stared back, pristine and alive, while he was a shadow fading. The train rattled on, its rhythm a dirge. The husks didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, but he felt their presence, hollow souls tethered to this endless journey. His chest ached, a hollow space where something vital had been torn away. He remembered the pub quiz, his flat, his life, but it felt distant, like a story he'd read, not lived. He sank into a seat, the fabric crumbling under him. The realization settled, heavy and final. He wasn't the one who'd left Blackwell Station. The copy had taken his place, wearing his face, his memories, while he remained here, another silent one, collected by the train. His hands brushed the wall, finding new scratches. James, 2025. His mark, his prison. The lights flickered, and the child appeared beside him, not a husk, but still wrong, her smile a permanent scar. She rested her head against his arm, cold and still, and whispered without sound, "Welcome home." The train rolled on into the void, and James knew it would never stop. Not for him, not for any of them. Did you feel the shadows creeping closer as these stories unfolded? The stage is still watching, the hollow guest lingers behind the door, and the silent ones wait beneath the tracks, ready to pull you in. Want to escape their grip? Then don't. Just sit there in the dark. Subscribe to the channel now. Hit that button before the curtains part again. Ring the notification bell, or you might miss your cue when the next nightmare begins. Give this video a like to keep the lights flickering, and drop a comment below with your suggestion for the next horror, because if you don't, the train might stop for you next. No engagement, no way out. You've been warned. Ignore this, and you'll be the one trapped in the void, staring into the mirrors with no one to hear your screams.